Great. Hello, everyone. Hope everybody's having a good Thursday. My name is Joe Steiner, the Solutions Architect here at Concurrency. And today we're going to be talking about how do we modernize our workloads with Microsoft Azure. Really what we're taking the focus of is kind of a bird's eye view in some ways and diving in a little bit further into how we might migrate workloads to Azure, whether we have a scenario that we have something on premise we want to move up there, or we have something in another cloud, and this could be we've got to move it because A, we're switching cloud providers, B, we've had a larger organizational change event, mergers, acquisitions, divestiture. This needs to switch clouds there. All of them, kind of end up following the same frameworks, if you will. And so we're going to be talking today about those kind of core frameworks. Some of these will be probably old hat for some of you, but we want to make sure it covers for everybody. And then hopefully there's some good content for everybody as we get into the thick of migrating workloads into the cloud. So without any further ado, let's get into the first kind of core framework underlying all this is Microsoft's Cloud Adoption Framework. If you are newer to Azure, this is a great place to start, as it provides kind of just, step-wise guidance into how to kind of plan your cloud journey, and even as you get going, how to continually kind of review your cloud operations and make sure that you're continually improving upon those. The first 4 steps there from strategy to plan to ready to adopt, really about kind of entering and putting workloads in the cloud for the first time. Whereas the govern, secure, and manage sections of the cloud adoption framework are intended to be ongoing, recurring. You're cycling through those, continually reviewing your environment, continuing to improve upon what you're doing up there, and moving further along in your maturity model, which we'll talk about a little later. Underlying this, and this will be something else we'll talk about in a little bit, is the well-architected framework. And so as we get into moving stuff actually into the cloud and kind of refining what we're doing up in the cloud, the well-architected framework's a great place to start. I highlight this for everyone here because frequently Microsoft has funding programs available, and if you're going to take advantage of those, generally they want to make sure that you're following at some levels the cloud adoption framework and or a well-architected framework process or approach towards the market. So it's good even for experienced Azurites, I guess, to be able to understand what these models are asking for and recommending, and being able to leverage those as you go. Amy, if you're on, I apologize, but I'm not sure if we've got a question in the chat. If we do, if you don't mind monitoring, just letting me know.
Will do. No questions at this time, but I'll let you know if we get one.
Great, perfect. So as we're, one of the first steps in moving into Azure, and again, for those of you that have already migrated to Azure, are familiar with this, you probably already solved this, but it is something worth reviewing even over time. And that is kind of thinking about the people side of this and what is going to be your cloud operating model. Generally meaning what groups are going to manage what inside of Azure. We'll talk a lot today about the concept of having kind of platform services, core shared services that any workloads that we have in Azure will utilize. And then beyond that, having more workload specific services and environments, landing zones as we get into that. And really there's kind of 3 general models for how you might have your people aligned to managing the services within there. First one is centralized model, where we have one cloud team. They control everything end to end. They manage it all, which is great. You have a lot of control in that environment. You're very easy to implement standards in that kind of world. However, as you scale up and in terms of what you're doing in Azure, sometimes that can be a little bit of a hindrance, as you might need some more specialties in different areas, and or just with the volume of work inside of there too. Shared management, we found, has been a pretty good middle ground there, where I will have platform teams, maybe product owners of certain aspects of Azure, handling and managing those aspects. That could be in the platform landing zone. I might have things like kind of a core identity structure inside of there, various, kind of centralized networking core services, maybe some of the security, core security services. Again, security will be something that gets embedded everywhere. Networking will have its place everywhere, but there might be some more centralized core services there that get handled. You may even have, kind of more centralized data structures inside of your environment. That might be something. So you can have teams that either specialize in those, or having a platform team across those. They manage that kind of core central shared services, and then have workload teams. These could be teams that are more aligned with certain business units that own certain workloads, or aligned with certain technologies contained therein. And that platform team is responsible for the platform, the shared services, but also then for general Azure governance. We found that's a pretty good model there, where they kind of lead the way in governance and provide those guardrails that then the workload teams can operate in. What it does is it allows for, if the platform's set up and it has all the needs of the workload teams, that's just ongoing and improving what you have in terms of those core central services. But then the workload teams are able to very quickly spin things up within the guardrails that they're allowed to operate in, and allows for kind of a good mix of standards and agility when you use that kind of model. Decentralized, you can have each team own their own environment, and it becomes a little bit of the Wild West out there sometimes, but some organizations, that's the best way to operate. And it really depends on the nature of your organization there too. If we'll have some companies that are kind of a mix of smaller companies that have come together. Decentralized may have just kind of happened naturally, and maybe over time it might evolve to more shared management, but maybe not. They may, if they continue to operate independently, each one operates their own environments, and that's what's best for that organization. There's nothing wrong with these. It's really whatever's right for you and your organization there. Across there, each team can have its own environment. It allows them to have autonomy and control of their own environment end to end. But you have less standardization when you look across all of those. And so it really becomes a function of what does the organization want? And it's usually important to align with kind of broader organization trends. Are we trying to consolidate services more within these disparate business units and maybe entities acquired over time, or are they going to be separated because there may be some changes to that even? And so rather than having to unhook all that, you may just leave those and run independently. So just a lot of things to consider here. Very important that you have some sense of, hey, this is how we want to operate, because then you can drive everything else, management, security operations, everything we're going to talk about today, towards your operating model, and that will dictate how things go from there. Okay. Another important concept, again, kind of very core, a lot of you have likely seen this before, is the shared responsibility model. As you're considering your cloud operating model, it's good to keep this in mind. And really what this is illustrating is between whether you're running software as a service, platform as a service, or infrastructure as a service, who has responsibility for managing the different aspects therein, whether that's the customer, whether that's something that Microsoft has then, taken on because it's running this as a software as a service offering or as a platform as a service offering. There are aspects of that that'll run, which wouldn't be the case if your loading thing is infrastructure as a service. It's important for the cloud operating model because, okay, what are we going to be asking people to do and to manage, and how much are we putting on their plate, having those kind of considerations. It's also important, though, when you're considering architectures later on and what you're going to migrate to and what's going to be the ultimate total cost of ownership for different architectural decisions that happen. Because if I'm able to use platform as a service, it may cost a little more, but I may save enough in not having to manage certain aspects and how that runs to offset that. And that's really the economic decision that needs to occur with all this. So it's an important thing to keep in mind as you're making, personnel decisions, operating model decisions, as well as then architectural decisions later on. So that's why we bring it here. In all cases, information and data is your own, devices counts an identity. But then backing into if I'm using things like SQL platform as a service, I'm not worried about the operating system underneath there. Certain aspects of the kind of core infrastructure are just managed for me versus me running a SQL Server instance in the cloud in a VM myself, which would be more of an infrastructure as a service situation. So just kind of, to illustrate some of the differences therein and where you want to factor that into your decision making. So away from kind of the foundational things, if we look at your general migration phases, you'll have a kind of discovery decision framework at the front end, then your planning, and then really the execution at the end. There's a tool offered for free from Microsoft which can help in a lot of cases, highly recommended, and that's Azure Migrate. You can use that at the front end to inventory existing workloads if those are on premise, can take an inventory of that, examine the software, examine different aspects of that workload, and then can compare that to here's what that would look like in the cloud, and even help you migrate it as you get into the execution phase. It also can be used in other cloud services. So if you have business unit that might be hosted in Amazon in an infrastructure as a service offering today, it could be analyzed using Azure Migrate as well, and then look at, okay, what's the underlying components of this, how do those translate to Azure, and even again help with the migration. Some of the platform as a service offerings that ultimately you'll use those native tools within AWS or Google, but Azure Migrate can help with infrastructure as a service offerings in other clouds, as well as then your on-premise infrastructure that you might be migrating that way. Very, very useful, provides a lot of information, and then again can be used as the actual migration tool therein. So a great end-to-end tool for that. So again, you start with the inventory of the environment. We'll kind of talk about the different things to do along these phases here. You kind of assess, make sure that this translates to Azure and how you want to translate it to Azure. Frequently, there's multiple choices. There's almost always multiple choices as to how you might do it. The other thing to make sure you're picking out at the front end is what are all the dependencies of that application? What else is it tied to? Could be simple things like, maybe not always so simple to move, but an underlying database structure that sits behind the application. It might have ties to other applications as well. You'll have to plan into there how do I want to handle that? Is that going to be moved in the split migration fashion? Is that something that we're going to move together? Maybe we start bringing all of those applications and migrating those at the same time because of that. That will impact decisions quite a bit when you're looking at dependencies there. You also look at, what outside systems are, is this connected to, is it dependent on, or are dependent on it? If you move this, are you going to able to maintain those dependencies? Do you need to maintain those dependencies? And that kind of thing. We'll talk a little bit further about that. And then that all goes into, okay, how am I going to migrate? And there's a host of options there. There's kind of a range that we're going to talk about in terms of, is this something worth migrating, or how do I migrate it? Am I going to make major changes to it? Am I just going to move it more as is? Those kind of things. And again, having all that information from your initial inventory and your dependency analysis is going to drive those decisions as you go to migrate those environments. From there, then you make your determination, and then it's about, okay, what are we building out here? And we'll talk a little bit about landing zones and how do you structure those the right way for these different scenarios. Assessing the workload. Core things you want to pull in are CPU and memory usage, disk IO, network throughput, user load inside of there, all those kind of core metrics within the application itself that are driving what that next architectural decisions will be in terms of the services. How much CPU and memory do I need in the service? When I'm selecting a service, there's going to be different options in terms of the service level that I will need to invoke, and I need this information at the front end. You need to know this both for kind of peak times as well as what is the ongoing average there, and that'll help guide those architectural decisions later. You need to understand the configuration details. Is this, hosted on-premise, in hardware? Is this in a VM? What VM structure is used there? OS, other software involved, so on. If the coding in there, it's good to know what coding language and framework is being used. As we'll talk about in a little bit, but all these things need to come into place there. From security, identity configurations, encryption, very important, and then the broader network and security configuration of the application. These all may be things that are one way today and need to be changed or should be changed as you move forward, but it's good to know where you're starting from, because as you translate this and migrate this into the cloud, you need to make sure that you've got a good plan for what those impacts are going to be, so you don't have surprises. Compatibility issues. Azure Migrate will actually help with that, and that becomes hey, you're using this version of software. Here's how this might, or this service. Here's how that's going to translate, and you might have issues with this or that. Very, very useful to be able to call those out ahead of time, so you can plan that as you're architecting the solution, and it'll help frame what decisions you use in terms of the migration strategy ultimately. It also, what are the remediations, again, from compatibility issues for anything else that we've picked up, what are the required remediations? And these fall into generally two classes. One is, what do we need to do before we migrate it, and pre-migrations, as well as then what needs to happen afterwards as maybe a post-migration thing. So I can move it as is, but I'm going to have to make some changes to this once I move that infrastructure or that application, the workload up to Azure. Again, mapping dependencies, very important. For internal dependencies, these would be things within the workload that will be reconstructing these elements there. And that's when we look at internal, it's hey, here's all the pieces that we're going to be re-architecting up in the cloud and migrating. What are those pieces there? And frequently, one of the best things to do there is to use some monitoring tools, whether that's network or application performance monitoring, to check those connections with a workload and study that for a little bit, and you can see where the calls are, where there's traffic between different elements of the workload, where it is today, whether that's another cloud or another cloud instance or on premise, and being able to look at where what it's communicating with and understand where some of those dependencies are. Sometimes you will find surprises here where we've seen where organizations didn't realize that one application was talking to another service or another component in your infrastructure, and it kind of was happening behind the scenes a little more. So applying some monitoring to that can help identify those situations. And then external, you really want to check in on any other SaaS platforms, APIs, third-party services. If I've got something in the cloud already, does it still have some on-premise ties? The data pipelines and data there, right, and external databases that are connected through here, authentication services. So a whole host of things there you want to make sure that you're taking into account. And that's both things that might be feeding information into your workload or your application, but also that are receiving information from there. And it's good to understand all that's involved there, because again, that will help with your migration planning and ensuring success as you go forward here. Other requirements. Regulatory compliances, it's important to understand that, moving things in the cloud actually can help with that frequently in a lot of ways, but you want to make sure you understand what the regulatory needs are pertaining to the type of application, type of data that's flowing through there, and your industry in particular. Understanding what the performance expectations are in terms of SLAs, RPOs, RTOs. What is that today versus what does that need to be? Is there a change in expectation that's coming for moving it to the cloud? And how does that need to be factored in? That will be very important as you're deciding the redundancy, resiliency options inside of here, particularly, as well as then performance, the general performance of the application, and maybe the networking connectivity decisions that are going to be involved, as well as the services underlying there. There may be certain services that are better suited giving the performance requirements in there as well. Also understand, do you have production, test, dev? Are you, so we've seen 2 levels, we've seen 3, we've seen 4, and in terms of that production, test, dev environments, and understanding, what the expectations within those are and how those are being used. Also, if you have any independent software vendors that are planning on being moved to the cloud, make sure that you understand what their cloud instance, the details of that, and a little further. It's not always the same as what they maybe had on premise. And so that's a good one to make sure you're keeping an eye on as well. In addition to the kind of the core infrastructure pieces, underlying software, performance, all that, any applications where you've coded that yourselves, you want to make sure to understand the frameworks and coding languages used. There's a host of tools out there that can help with that. AppCat's one, Cast is another recommended one. Really depends on the language and framework that you're using as to which tool to use to analyze the code, and then ensure that as you're moving that over to Azure, that you've got a good sense of what that needs to, how that's going to translate, any changes that maybe need to be made. Again, this will play into migration strategies heavily. The other piece there is that underlying databases. So if I know I have databases combined with this, again, is that database working with any other applications? What are the other ramifications for that database in moving to the cloud with it? And or am I going to operate in more of a split environment where the database stays where it is? I move the front end of the application, and I then have to have some connectivity between those two environments. Azure Migrate can help with this. There's also the data migration assistant if I'm going to be moving that data there to help assess those associated databases. So all that information that we've collected, the performance of the application, the requirements, different aspects of the underlying database, the application code, that then comes into, okay, what is going to be my migration strategy? And here's kind of a very simple version of that Microsoft has as part of the cloud adoption framework in terms of recommendations for how to proceed. So if you got an existing workload, we're migrating this, whether it's on premise or from another cloud. As I've looked at this, I've collected all my data. I then can kind of go through this decision framework to determine what is it that I want to do with this, right? So if it's, something that this is, low value, redundant, consider, should it be retired? Is there some aspect of the functionality that is performed by another tool? Do I still need this? That's one thing to consider as you're going through that. Otherwise, then, do I need to have just, minimal disruption to this? It works great as is, and I really maybe don't have the time to modernize. I don't have the necessary skill sets. It may not translate very easily to a modernization, might be more complicated. Maybe you just rehost that. And that's really putting that into moving it as is and moving it into more of an IaaS arrangement where I've taken it just like it is as a VM or as on-premise infrastructure, and I've just recreated that and copied that in some ways to the cloud and rehosted that. Again, Azure Migrate can help with that. If I have the ability to make some changes, here's where we've got kind of a host of different levels of that. And really what you're deciding here is how much modernization can I undertake with this application, given all the parameters that we know about it, and how far can I take that? Beginning with replatforming, can I use platform as a service solutions where previously I maybe had a SQL server created for this application? Can I use the Azure SQL platform and leverage that for my database needs, and then run everything else on there? There's other platforms in there as well, that platform as service offerings, that I might lever those, and allows me then, like we had said earlier, the cloud operating model, if then that falls under then whoever's managing the platform. If that's in a centralized, then that's the same team. Otherwise, it's going to be different. You want to consider that as well when you're making these kinds of decisions. What's the impact to the technology, to the application, to the end user, but also the people managing it to some degree? What's that going to be like? So that might be the kind of that next level of modernization that we're able to undertake at this time. If we're able to proceed further, and I am going to make I can make some code changes to this, and or need to make code changes to this for other reasons. We knew that this had to be modernized anyways. Well, moving it to the cloud is a good opportunity to do that, and so then I can make those changes there just in the code, but I'm not really re-architecting the solution. I may be just modernizing the code a little bit. I'm still using the same framework generally, but maybe making some changes there. Well, then that's more of a refactor it, and then I can optimize it for the cloud as I do that. If I want to take a more drastic step, maybe I'm going to undertake more, containers for the first time with this application, or I'm really re-architecting the underlying infrastructure, that's where we're going the re-architect path, where I'm going to really take advantage of that cloud, take advantage of the scaling and resilience options that maybe containers, if this application allows itself to be a containerized application, that I can move that way and re-architect the solution that way. If we're make changes, one of the things, and this may be something you actually consider early in here, is there a SaaS offering that does what this application does, that and does that make sense, right? In terms of cost, in terms of the functionality provided, does that meet the needs? That might be you might just replace this. And I would say that one's, generally something, a good time to consider this, whether we're retiring, whether replacing, and like we'll see at the end, really just, should this thing just stay where it is, and we solve for this at another time. But that beyond that, there's kind of rebuilding of this. This is really where we're got a situation on. This could be an older app. Rather than translate it to the cloud in some fashion, I'm going to rebuild something that's more cloud native and using more microservices and kind of modern application cloud frameworks there, and being able to leverage that in the cloud. And this provides that opportunity to say, hey, let's just rebuild this. If I have the time, if that makes sense given my situation here, that's another option inside of here. Is the rehost, replatform, refactor, re-architect. I'm really taking the existing application and either not really making changes or making some higher levels of changes as I go across those, and translating that to the cloud. Beyond that, I could retire it, I could replace it, I could just rebuild something, based on that to continue to provide those services to the end users, and or I keep it on premise, and maybe this isn't a good candidate right now, and I'm going to focus somewhere else. Especially if you're talking about migrating a number of things in, this might be hey, I'm going to retain this right now where it is. Let's move the other workloads that I need first, and then this might be something that we address at a later date. So really, all of this will include plans and be based on the dependencies that are involved, all of the assessments that's done up front. That should really help drive this decision, so that really one or two of these options becomes pretty clear in the end. It really helps the decision-making process there. Obviously, cost, time, all of those things factor into all of these decisions, as well as the skill level of the people involved. Here's where partners like Concurrency can come and help with that. Things that we do quite a bit of. But that's something to factor in, and Concurrency can help you through all of these things. We've done this with many customers, and so you feel free to leverage our come to us, and we're happy to work with you and utilize our expertise in this space. Again, broader migration planning. I've talked about the migration strategy. Other things to consider here are what are the dependencies, and what's the plan for those? I've made my decision to maybe rehost this. Okay, there's a database behind that that's still connected to something else. Is that temporarily unmovable? And then how am I addressing that? I'm rehosting certain aspects of the workload, but there is some dependencies that I need to have connectivity to, and you want to make sure that that's all considered in here. The kind of planning process really helps you prioritize. If I've got multiple workloads that I'm looking to migrate, how do I prioritize which ones happen first? Generally, we'd recommend you want to move the simplest ones first, and then ramp up from there. And usually it's a mix of kind of if I've got things that involve a little lower effort but are higher value, those are the best places to start, and then kind of work down from there to those that might be a little more effort and still high value, to those that are kind of less effort, low value in the end. So there's kind of a prioritization that we can help you with this as well, but it's important to prioritize those, time those out, factor that effort into the decisions as to when to move what, in addition to all the dependencies and the other things we've talked about. Really, one of the core pieces here is, along with the migration strategy, you got to determine your approach. Is this something where I can afford some downtime during a cutover or during the process, or do I need to maintain that near zero? That will dictate sometimes architectural decisions at some levels, and or generally just kind of the approach as to how you're going to actually execute the migration. But it's important to understand, can we afford to have downtime when moving this, and when those windows are, versus those things that can't. They're operating 24/7. Highly important. Okay, we need to make sure that this is replicated, ready to go, and then we can just easily transition from one place to the other. And you want to also, in your migration plan, have the rollback plan just in case. Always recommend this and hope you don't ever need to use it, but it's better to have it than not, as anybody that's done any project planning would tell you. In terms of planning the Azure environment then, so we've kind of made our architectural decision, we started to make our migration strategy decisions, beginnings of some of the architectural decisions there. How do I then plan the Azure environment? And really one of the first places to start is how am I going to set up my landing zones? Landing zones, and this comes into, okay, what's my broader cloud operations model? What are the nature of the workloads and my broader plan for what's going to happen inside of Azure? Landing zones provide those kind of the core framework for basic services and generally how you're going to manage Azure as a whole inside of there. We'll talk about that in a moment. It's addition to the landing zone architecture, you get down into, okay, specific workload architectures there that are going to be leveraged. What does it, that'll be dictated frequently by the migration strategy. Is this, going to be an IaaS move? Okay, well then I need to recreate what I have already. If I'm replatforming, re-architecting, that's going to be a different architecture. And so it's good to understand what my ideal migration strategy is, and then that'll allow you to pick out the appropriate workload architecture. There are a number of generally well-tested architectural frameworks already available that have been done by customers before. It's generally recommended to start there and then make some modifications rather than reinventing the wheel as you're looking at how to proceed with all of this. The next level down will be, okay, we've got this broader architecture. I need my SQL services here. I need a web front end, need some security components in there. Here's where those things would sit in my landing zone architecture. Now, okay, what are the specific services in Azure that I'm gonna be utilizing? In certain cases that could be, am I using a PaaS versus an IaaS approach towards, say, SQL, for instance? Where is that going to sit? Which would be dictated maybe by my cloud operations model, what are some of the other services that are going to be needed and to support this application? Another layer down from that is, okay, what level of service tier do I need for that? Again, this is where the assessments on the CPU memory utilization, all the performance needs of the application, that will dictate those service tiers. But then you need to understand what level of, using that same assessment information, what level of availability do I need to support with this application? Um, what level of redundancy do I need within the services? Very important when we're doing architectural decisions. Um, and making sure that you are set up, either spread across different regions, and this will tie into region decisions. Do I need to have this spread across different regions, given the nature of the application and what I needed, its availability, how it's going to be utilized? Do I have this, consolidated within certain regions versus others? That'll be all things that need to be considered here as you're establishing your architecture. Highly recommend using the well-architected framework as a reference for this. And the nice thing with the well-architected frameworks, we'll talk in a minute, is that it provides general guidance and proven ways to utilize Azure and construct things in Azure that have been tested before and proven, are supported by Microsoft, and that are able to be utilized and then built upon, so that you can continue to ramp up the maturity of your environment over time. Kind of quick view of landing zones. I understand this is an eye chart, but it does provide some illustration towards different types of landing zones, where I might have platform landing zones where I've got inside of there, I'll have my subscriptions contained, which is kind of a core element within Azure, as many of you likely know. So I'll have kind of a management subscription in there in the platform, security, some connectivity, which handles a lot of my kind of core networking needs. I might have my other data subscriptions inside of the kind of core platform data environments inside of there. And then within the workloads, I'll have different subscriptions for different workloads, being able to allow for each workload to have its own subscription to operate a little independently of others, but utilizing those same core platform services that I have with everything else. Again, kind of the steps to deploying this is, again, use reference architectures. Begin there, begin with work that's done before. And then there's even off of those implementations for how to get to that architecture and build it. It should be very useful in speeding up your process and operating in a proven manner as you're going forward here. Different design areas within the landing zones that to be considered is one, what's kind of my billing construct. This will dictate frequently how I construct subscriptions, resource groups, things like that. What is my resource organization? How am I grouping things within there? What do I need for identity and access management? What's the nature of the underlying applications? What are the services they're going to need across maybe multiple different workload landing zones that are in there? What do they need, across all those? And general network topology. Talk about the different types of network connectivity between ExpressRoute, VPN, and so on. What are we doing as an organization to connect to Azure, and how does that then translate to each workload need as I go from there? And the kind of more the compliance design side will have kind of that management plane, the security plane, broader governance. This is both in terms of ties into security, but also gets into cost controls. Am I able to manage the costs of Azure across all of these in an effective manner? And then ultimately, how much am I driving automation through all this in order to make my life easier, and there's security benefits from automation. There's a host of benefits from that. So what am I able to do and able to undertake here and construct, given the nature of my workloads and maybe my maturity with Azure? How much automation am I able to leverage? As I'm preparing for the landing zone, as we talked about a moment ago, connectivity is very important. Well, how am I connecting to Azure? Am I using ExpressRoute? Am I using VPN? Do I need some kind of Azure virtual WAN between different areas? For identity, highly recommend using Entra, Active Directory. There's a lot of host of services there that you're going to be leveraging, and that's a really important as we get into well-architected framework. Identity is really an important control plane for that, as well-architected framework is really driven by zero trust, and that's those principles are built into that. You have to make decisions on how we're architecting our DNS structure so that we're able to provide name resolution across the services. Where is that hosted? How is that connecting to maybe it being hosted outside of this cloud environment, or am I running it within here? Firewall and routing constructs in there to protect the whole environment. You'll see as you get into the well-architected framework, you don't want to expose any of your virtual machines to the outside world. So I'll nest those within firewalls, obviously, and protect that. And there'll be different firewall constructs that I'll leverage there. And then really what's going to be my broader monitoring and management approach towards this. What are the tools? What is the information that I'm going to need there, and what services am I using to provide that so that I can maintain and manage the environment appropriately, monitor costs, monitor faults within the environment, handle incidents, all of that. So again, underlying all of that is the well-architected framework, and within there's 5 primary pillars. Reliability is a big one. So how resilient do I need this application to be? Security, cost optimization. Then you get into the operational excellence side of this, where how easy is it to manage this broader environment? How well am I handling that? And then performance efficiency. Have I built this to be at the level that I need it to provide the performance? And what are some of the improvements that can be made there? This is a ongoing process where I'm continually looking at each of these pillars and ensuring that I'm doing the best that I can in managing these environments across these different pillars. There's a lot of guides online. This is again something where Concurrency can help guide you through this, and it's important to be following this. If you're using any Microsoft funding, they will frequently evaluate if you're following these principles before they fund any workloads or any work inside of there. Again, speaking to the ongoing nature of this, the maturity model, there is a step level process here. You may not be at level 5 when you first go into Azure. I wouldn't expect that you would be. Ideally you're at, kind of those initial levels and are following the guidance there and then improving over time. It doesn't have to be perfect up front, but it has to be good enough. You have to have obviously the right security in there. You have to have the right cost controls inside of there. You can't let this run out of control on you, but I may not have to take those next level steps immediately. I can start at a level that's appropriate for my organization, what I'm actually doing in Azure. Really, as I'm just getting into Azure, that's more the case. As I've been in there a little bit, you want to be moving along this maturity model to take full advantage of the cloud, the cost optimization that can occur, the performance optimization, the management optimization. As much of, you'll see automation's a big part of this. Zero trust is a big part of this when it comes to the security pieces of this. Kind of those core cloud frameworks that you're hearing all the time from Microsoft and in broader in architectural circles that are really kind of the frameworks for how to design things in today's cloud age. So again, just want to highlight here that it doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be good enough and up front, and then you can kind of evolve this over time as we've helped a number of customers do in their cloud journey. So that's what we had to share today. Hopefully that provided a kind of a quick view of the frameworks that to be used, keep you compliant with what Microsoft support would expect to see, as well as just good proven frameworks for how to move to the cloud. So with that, I say thank you. And if anybody has any questions, we can field those. Otherwise, I hope everybody has a great day.
Thanks, Joe. I don't see any questions. So take care. We'll close out the event. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.